Okay, I think it's on now, right, the mic? Okay. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Welcome, everyone. So this session is about cloud innovation and security. Actually, it's more about security assurance, right? So we are going to dive deep in terms of the cloud accreditation systems that are in play today in the world. So let's get started. So in the recent years, you will see that there is an emergence of fintech industry in the world. And that has caused the financial institution in particular to start to rethink about the way they look at new technologies and change their approach in the adoption of new technologies. They know that if they don't change, they are going to get obsolete very quickly and replaced by all the various new fintech services that are out there. So for financial institutions that have embraced the public clouds, they have started to realize the efficiency that they can gain by using the cloud. For example, like in the area of high performance computing, data analytics, digital transformation, security and compliance, as well as disaster recovery. Cloud has also enabled a lot of these financial institutions to innovate faster and open new market opportunities at the same time. For example, they can now experiment with new mobile applications and find out whether the customer likes those new experiences through their usage and also through their response. And through the experimentation, they can iterate very quickly and innovate very fast. So that allows them to open up new markets and address new customer needs as they grow. So, and all this can be done without actually the need for investing in expensive infrastructure and also the data center itself. Financial institutions, of course, can also, they have petabytes of data about the customer transactions and all the things that are going on in the industry. So they can actually use cloud-based, set up cloud-based data lakes and establish querying services to be able to do data analytics and find out the behavioral patterns of customers and so on very quickly, again, without the needs to set up data warehouses. So these are, so in fact, if you look at every industry itself, there are changes that are going on, and every industry, there are early adopters of clouds that are using the cloud technology in very meaningful ways. So governments are also starting to pay attention to the cloud, especially in the public cloud space itself as well. So they are learning that the ability to innovate is becoming very critical and transformative for the governments, especially in the area of providing better citizens' experience, strengthening public safety, as well as lowering costs. So there are today there are more than 5,000 organizations, government organizations, 10,000 educational institutions, and 28,000 non-profit organizations that are already on AWS cloud. So a lot of these customers have now recognized that it is not just innovations that are the good reasons for using cloud, but in fact, security is also an important factor, which I will elaborate slightly later, right? So, but if security is not positioned carefully, especially when we look at how to gain security assurance of cloud service provider, not just hyperscale cloud service provider like AWS, but also the service provider on top of the infrastructure stack itself, especially like the SaaS provider, right? You will find that security could become a showstopper. It could become a bottleneck in the cloud adoption journey that can slow down the entire program of cloud adoption and cloud migration. So cloud security accreditation is one of those very key areas that especially governments need to pay attention. Of course, enterprise has also been doing a lot of those things, but they are predominantly basing their approach on like international standards and industry best practices, which again, I will talk about that later on. So the objective of this session is really for us to share best practices from our observation and participation in many of these crowd accreditation programs, both in the government as well as in the commercial sectors. So we will take a quick overview of the current situation, especially in the international space, of what the governments are doing, right? What are the approaches they are taking? Like, for example, publishing a crowd-first policy or a crowd-by-default policy, establishing a crowd security accreditation scheme, and some of the challenges that they are dealing with today. So we will dive deep into some of these accreditation schemes and present a proposed framework in terms of what is a way that could actually balance the desire to use crowd to innovate faster and at the same time achieve the security objective of using crowd as well and not compromising any security, right? So we will also review from the perspective of shared responsibility model. What are the implications when you are moving into the crowd, right? Given that in the public cloud arena, shared responsibility is a very important area to pay attention to, right? After that, then I will summarize what we have gone through before we close the session itself. So let's dive in. So if you look at this chart itself, right, since 2011, the US federal government launched the FedRAMP program with the crowd-first strategy. Right? Today we have about 22 governments in the world that have published some form of a crowd-first or a crowd-by-default or more recently, a smart crowd-native kind of a policy. So that is what the UK government has done recently. There are also a number of governments that did not have a formal policy in place, but they are also going very quickly in terms of adopting crowd and looking at how to leverage the public cloud itself, right, to innovate faster, to provide new experience to their citizens and also new public services and so on. So why public cloud, you may ask, right? So these are some of the reasons that the various governments have stated in their crowd-first policy or the crowd-by-default strategy and so on. So I will not read this in detail, but just to summarize, right, these are the key attributes that they are looking at, right? These are key benefits that they're looking for, and in fact, we all know that public clouds, in fact, are providing a lot of these capabilities, a lot of these benefits, not just to the governments, but also to the commercial enterprise world for the last decade or so, right? More than a decade. So in particular, I'd like to point out, right, like for example, cost saving. Cost saving, we have the capability that by using public cloud, you convert, right, your capital expense to variable expense. And because of the economic of skills that AWS provide, the variable expense tends to be much lower than any enterprise or organization can achieve by their own, running their own data centers and on-premise services. Agility, the ability for any organizations to be able to spin up hundreds or thousands of servers, right, within minutes and able to address peak loads very quickly. Right? With elasticity, it means that they can scale up and down very fast, right? When the demand is higher, especially in the government's context, when you look at the need to provide for, say, emergency response or emergency situation where you need to announce a particular situation, and you can expect suddenly there will be a surge of traffic to your website or in the use of your mobile apps, things like that, right? And you won't want to provision for thousands of servers to cater for this kind of peak situation, right? When there isn't a lot of emergency going on. And if there is a lot of emergency every day, then there is a bigger problem to solve, right, in the first place. So normally you provision on what is a normal traffic, And then when in an emergency situation, you can scale up very quickly, and you can address all those sudden surge of loads. And that is what elasticity in the public cloud can provide. Right? Of course, resiliency is something that we build within AWS cloud infrastructure. As you attend, as you listen to Steve Smith, our CISO, talk yesterday, the keynote yesterday, he showed the global infrastructure that we have. We have 21 regions in the world and 66 availability zones that can allow applications to load balance between the availability zone or between regions and do the automatic failover and load balancing and so forth. Right, so application can be highly resilient. Right, you can make sure that application is highly available even when the data center is down. Right? So of course, operational efficiency comes along with all these benefits, and I think more importantly is the security. Right? In fact, cloud itself provides several security advantages. For example, one good thing about one very strong benefit, I would say, is that if you compare to traditional organizations, in fact, especially for government organizations that have been running data centers for many years, for decades, you'll find that you start to lose track of the inventory of servers and devices that you have in your environment. And this is a big problem, not just in government, also in many enterprises that are on-premise. Right? So just to get an inventory of these devices and servers, you have to invest a lot of money to buy software, to install agents, right? To start collating all this information. The cloud itself actually provides a clean sheet for you to start all over again, in the sense that you examine all your legacy applications and new applications that you need. You can experiment with a new infrastructure, with a new security architecture. And if this doesn't work, you can quickly deprovision it within minutes without risk itself and restart again. And doing this itself, you only pay for what you are using, and you are not required to invest upfront millions of dollars in order to be able to do that kind of things. Right? So you can experiment from small to big very quickly. And another very important advantage is that in hypercloud services like AWS itself, there are already many security tools and services. I believe in yesterday's and today's session, you have heard a lot about all the security tools, right? CloudTrails, CloudWatch, configs, inspectors, security hubs, and so on. There's so many tools out there, right, that you can actually use, right, just by clicking buttons, and you don't need to negotiate with any vendors, right, for a free trial, right, or get a budget of multi-million dollars to acquire the license in order to use these security tools or services, right? And same for all the other security service solutions that are available in the marketplace itself, right? You can, again, use them and only pay for what you are using. If you are not going to use them anymore, you disable the tool, and that's it. You stop paying for it, right? And that, again, is a very important capabilities for you to experiment, to actually be able to solve problems very quickly, right, and protect your information and move on, right? And if things doesn't work, you can start all over again, right, very quickly with very low risk. So these are the key motivators for governments, organizations, and of course also for enterprise to want to move to the cloud quickly, right? And of course, behind all these things is to drive innovation, provide better experience, and differentiate themselves against their competitors or other providers out there. Right? But of course, governments start to compare with other governments these days as well. So there are some kind of virtual competitions that is going on. But of course, these benefits itself are not sufficient enough to make sure that adoption is successful. Right? There are other factors that have to be considered. So these are the top concerns, again, in the cloud adoption journey itself. Right? Again, you see security as one of the top concerns. It is one of the key enablers that I mentioned earlier on, and it is also a concern because there are fears out there. Fears because of the perception of cloud security. Right? So So you have to address this, and it is very important in any cloud journey to be able to address this. Of course, you have to have a plan or a strategy and a plan to address the legacy system. You have to upskill the people in order to be able to operate in the cloud, to be able to develop in the cloud itself, or hire new talents. So all these require budgets, right, to be able to get things going, right? So there are still things that has to happen in order to be able to progress fast through the journey. But we will dive in the security accreditation area. So when you look at cloud security accreditation, there are many ways to do it, right? There are different processes that different governments or enterprises have established, right? So there are probably a lot of cat lovers here, so I will not talk about cats, right? But it's a similar things that you can. There are many ways to cook your meals, so to say, right? So, but we can boil it down to 4 critical steps when we talk about an accreditation system. The number 1 is to establish the security requirements. What are the requirements that you need the cloud security provider to fulfill, to be able to comply with, to meet before you can gain the confidence, right? So this normally should be at least the same, if not higher standards than what you have been operating on in the traditional environment, right? So from the cloud service provider perspective, is to be able to document and implement this the security plan itself, right, to achieve these requirements. So in the US, there's this FIPS 800. There's 53 standards, right, that establish the federal government information security and privacy requirements. And in the commercial world out there is the 27,000 series of standards, right, so-called the information security management systems and related standards. Right? We will talk a little bit more later on that. And once you have the security requirements, right, you will develop an audit process or assessment process so that you will determine who should be the one doing the audit. Should it be a third party, or should it be some organization such as an internal audit organizations within the departments to be able to perform this kind of audit assessment to know that the service providers are able to meet the requirements, right, to be able to validate their practices, their policy, and so on. So there are also international standards out there that prescribe some of the guidance in terms of how to audit an information security management system. The lost audio? Okay, all right. So, yeah, so 27,000 and 27,006 is the international standard that is specifically designed, right, to help establish the auditing procedures against the 27,001 series of standards, right? And 19,011 is a more generic auditing guidelines, right, for auditors. So with that, you can go through the assessment itself, right? CSP will have to go through the assessment. And after the assessment, normally will produce a report, an assessment report. And the authority have to assign, right, who should be the one that decide whether the CSP pass or doesn't pass the assessment itself, doesn't meet the criteria, how to provide the authorization. Should it be a centralized body made up of multiple stakeholders like the Joint Authorization Board in the case of the FedRAMP, the Federal Authorization, Risk Authorization and Management Program, right? FedRAMP itself, they use a Joint Authorization Board, and every agency can also have its authorization body established, right? Or in the case of the ISO, it is basically the auditors that do the accreditation, and then the user organization will decide whether to authorize the provider or not. Right, so then you will go through the authorization. The CSP will have to submit the report of assessment and other supporting documentations. And finally, it is to keep the system running. So this is the maintenance phase. This is a very important phase because you have to make sure that whatever changes that are going on in the environment, they get updated, right? Do you need to do a reassessment? When will you do a reassessment? And will you focus on only the delta, or you assess everything all over again? And in the case of the FedRAMP, there's also continuous monitoring, where every changes that are going on in the system, the CSP will have to provide the report, right, to the authority itself, right, to maintain the authorization. Right, so different scheme will use different approach in all these 4 phases. So we'll dive deeper again, right? So this is a snapshot of some of the more prominent schemes that are available globally today, right? So these are all government-run accreditation program, except for the last one, right, which is the Japan Ministry of Economics and Trade and Industry joint development with Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communication, right, for a new cloud service provider, cloud services security accreditation scheme. They call it the registration scheme. Right, so this is still in development today, right? But the rest are already in operation. You will find that every single one actually has slight different favor in terms of the approach that they adopt, right? So I've said for FedRAMP itself was the first one that actually came on board, right? And has very established standard by established operation today, right? It has gone through several rounds of changes. And then the AU, the Australia IRAP, right, is another program that mirrors to some extent the FedRAMP, but it's based on their own information security manual. Right, but the information security manual cover all of the government's requirements, which are about 50% of them actually does not fit into cloud requirements. So the Australia Signal Directorate is actually changing the standards itself. They are upgrading the standard. A new revision is actually coming out very soon. China also have its own scheme, right? The China scheme is based on 5 levels of security, right? Impact level, right? From impacting individuals all the way to impacting national security, right? So most organizations in the commercial world will have to gain at least a level 3, but level 4 and 5 are meant for government use. The difference is that the China system today, they are still not allowing the use of public cloud in the government itself, right? So it is mainly public, but the certification is required for all cloud systems, right? When they are even serving the commercial world, right? Commercial requirements. So Germany has a very different scheme, which I will talk about later on, and India actually simplified a lot of the approach. Basically, they adopt the international standard, and they use an RFP approach, publishing a request for proposal that is $0, and for CSP to get accredited, basically you submit a tender, kind of a tender for the proposal, by submitting all your documentations and go through an audit to validate that all your certification is correct and you actually have the service that you claim that you are providing, and they'll visit a data center and all that. So the India empanelment system is a much more simplified approach, which actually is very low cost to maintain and to operate as well. Right, the KISA program is quite stringent because of very specific requirements that they have specified in their standards. Right? And Korea itself actually have 2 standards. One is the Korean Internet Security Agency standards. The other one is a version of the 27001 standard, which is more broadly used in the industry itself. And Singapore has a multi-tier cloud security standards. Again, 3 level, and level 3 is meant for regulated workloads, right? And again, Singapore standards is based out of the 27001 standards, right? And only level 3 have more additional requirements, right, that are specified, mainly for regulated workloads needs. I already mentioned about Japan, so I will not elaborate further. I think another area to pay attention to is really on the maintenance aspect, right? Where we look at the maintenance, the cycle is mostly 3-year cycle with annual surveillance audit, except for FedRAMPs and the KISA requirements that they have continuous monitoring needs, right? So you have to provide reports of changes that are going on in the environment. So these various schemes are not without problems, right? They all have challenges. And so these are the top 6 challenges that we have observed and experienced over the past years as well, right? So one of the key one is really about developing and maintaining the standards and the auditing process, as well as the authorization process itself, right? So whether you adopt a particular standard or you develop, right? If you reinvent the wheel, you create new ones, it will take more time, basically, right? The type of workloads, how to decide the workloads that you want to be able to run in the public cloud, especially for governments, they are concerned about classified information. Up to what level of classification can workloads be actually running in the public cloud, right? This will actually grow, this will actually change as the confidence in public cloud security goes up over time. We have seen that actually in several governments, like for example in Singapore, as well as in Australia. Now Australia governments are already able to use public cloud for protected information, which is a higher level of classification. And Singapore has already gone into restricted classification kind of information, right? Skill and expertise I mentioned, right? It's not just about people within the government organization able to do provide the standards and know about the security of the cloud, but it's also the assessor. Do you have a pool of people out there that are able to do the assessment, able to do the audit, right? One of the programs that we've gone through, there is a shortage of assessors. So there's a long queue of requests for accreditation, but the assessors are so busy that they couldn't really get on board on the program itself to do the assessment. And then when it comes to the authorization, then there is another challenge, is that the agency that's supposed to be doing the authorization do not have the resources to be able to handle the queue of reports that have been submitted. So some reports have to wait like nearly a year before they actually get reviewed and get assessed. So that all this basically add-ons to the time for authorization itself. So if we look at, of course, one of the other things that is important is the addition of new services, right? How you cater for that. A lot of these schemes didn't provide for new services, and they start to change over time to handle this. So one of the examples we can look at is the journey that the FedRAMP system has gone through. So in 2010, February, right, the US Federal CIO announced about the idea of a FedRAMP, of the Federal Risk Authorization and Management Program itself, right? And a few months later, in June, they established the baseline standards, right? Create the standards, and then in November, they publish it for public comment. And until the next year, February, then the Cloud First strategy came out, right? In the federal government, and it became a formal policy endorsed in December 2011. So this itself is already 1 year past, more than 1 year has gone, right? And until May 2012, then 9 assessors get accredited. Right? You have to get a pool of assessors to be trained, upskill, to know how to audit the cloud, and then get the accreditation. And then they start to actually do the accreditation in June 2012, right? 30 of them launched, and the first provisional authorized to operate, right? Basically the authorization itself, but this provisional was published in December 2012, and AWS became the first, right, in May 2013 to actually gain the authorized to operate from one sponsoring agency itself, right? So this process itself, you look at it, it takes three years and 3 months, right, from beginning to end. Even if you count from the first crowd first strategy onward, it is 2 years and 3 months, right? So that is a long time, right? And Japan, in fact, is taking more or less the same journey, right? They published the crowd first policy in early 2018. They established a working group in July 2018, right, to start working on the entire scheme. And then early this year, they start to work on the standards requirements to consolidate, to start mapping FedRAMP, right, the IRAP, the IRAP-ISM, the 27001, and also their common standards that they have published 2 years ago for use in the government itself, right? So the standards today has not been formalized, right, and the scheme is going on trial probably starting in July. They have that is the plan, but whether it will launch on time, we are yet to be notified. In fact, today the ministry is going to announce plan for the trial itself, right? So as you can see, that whole process takes a long time. So we actually need a system that can actually go faster than this traditional approach, right? So what is a good system to do that, right? Of course, what we are saying is that the existing systems are not failure, right? They are just having challenges that we have to address. So we have to iterate, right, to continue to make improvement, right? Then we can become successful. So to have a good system itself, first of all, we look at the criteria. What does it take to have a good accreditation system, right? So you need to be efficient to operate, right? That means timely to enable the crowd adoption journey to move fast, right? Minimize the use of resources, right? Because especially for security resources, they are very limited, right? And to train someone to become a security professional, it takes time as well, right? And learning crowd takes time, right? So you want to be able to focus your resource on the most valuable assets in the most critical path in your crowd journey, rather than everything, right, that is going on, right? And of course, the cost itself is also important. As you go up the stack, right, it will be all the startups that are providing solution, right? You don't want them to be, you don't want a system where they have to pay a lot of money, right, before they can actually sell to the government, right? So that, again, the government will not be able to enjoy those services and innovate fast, right? So it will defeat the purpose of a crowd-first policy. You want it to be effective, meaning that it can address the dynamic changes that are going on in the crowd space itself, right? Technology space. And you want to be able to maximize reuse. How do I inherit existing schemes, existing certification? Can I reuse them as much as possible, right? And of course, we have to recognize that there is no perfect security, right? So same for security assurance, same for security accreditation. There's no perfect system. What is the most practical way in order to move on, right? How to be pragmatic about it, basically, right? So those are the criteria, and that's why the Prime Minister of Singapore, right, Lee Hsien Loong, he mentioned in the conference last year that we must continually strike the right balance between security and usability, right? You want to be able to use it and secure, right? Where is the balance? So before we dive in further, right? So these are the two schemes that are actually very popular today in the commercial world: the ISO 27001 standard and the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants scheme, the SOC standards, right? The SOX practice, the System and Organization Control Reporting practice, right? So the ISO standard has been in operations since the early 1990s or mid 1990s, right? Where it started with the British standard 7799, right? 7799-2 was the certification itself, and then it evolved over the years, right? So today there are actually more than 30,000 organizations, maybe even more than that, right? Maybe about 40,000 that actually has been certified under this particular scheme. when the working group work on this particular standard to do the revision from the 2007 version to the 2013 version, there were more than 2,000 contributions by more than 50 countries in the world, right, to help improve the standard. So every revision, there are thousands of contributions. And today, the working group is still very active, and they are still undergoing revision. In fact, the standards is still undergoing revision as we speak. Right? So this is something that every countries, every national bodies that is a member of ISO can actually participate, contribute, influence, and raise the bar for the standards itself. The SOC standard, the SOC approach is very common, especially in the financial institution, because of fiduciary reporting requirements on service provider integrity and security. Right? So you have SOC 1, 2, and 3. 3 is basically a summary of SOC 2 report on the website, right? And SOC 2 itself is the most important report itself, because it talks about it actually reports on the actual security practice, security and privacy practice of the organization being examined by the auditors, right? So this standards itself, this is based on the SSAE, the statement on standards of attestation, SSAE 18, right? And the assurance reports on controls at the service organization, ISAE 3402. So these are, the SSAE are the American standard, and the ISAE is the international standard, right, basically. So it has a long history as well since 1992, right, evolved from the SAS 70 reporting, right? SAS stands for Statements on Auditing Standards. So the financial industry basically use this as a means to know that the service provider is of good integrity and security when they provide service to the financial organization, right? So there are, besides the broad adoption and usage of these standards itself, another important point, another important difference is the way the audits are being executed or being carried out. So ISO itself is a 3-year cycle. So every 3 years there is a full audit that goes on to get a recertification. And every year there is a surveillance audit, right? That basically examine what has changed and covering certain scopes that will probably not given more attention in the previous audit, that kind of things, right? So there is a change of focus in surveillance audit and then recertification every 3 years. But for the SOC standard itself, it is a 6-monthly cycle. So basically, the auditor sits in the premises of the auditee organization. So they come to us in our office. They park themselves there. So a team of people park themselves in our organizations, and they start to review our practice against our policy, right? To be able to validate and know that we are actually practicing our policy, what we said itself. So this is very important, right? So and every 6 months they will issue a report, and the report itself is 100 over pages, right? So when you look at the SOC 2 report, you can have a very deep insight on our actual practice within the organization itself. So this is kind of a continuous monitoring or continuous audit that is going on, right? Every 6 months there is a report. And so with the auditor actually inside the organization doing this continuous audit, there is also a high chance, a much higher chance that the auditor will catch problem as part of this process itself. So this is another benefit of SOX reporting. Right, so as a result of this high bar in terms of these different standards that are out there, so the Canadian government has actually accepted these standards as the prerequisite for their part of their cloud strategy, and they did not implement a separate accreditation program as a result. So this is something of a good example to follow, in fact, right? So another very interesting example that we have seen is the German, oh sorry, before that, sorry, I should talk about this first. Yeah, so this is a snapshot of all the some of the government and industry certifications, right, schemes that we have achieved and continue to maintain over the years. So in the commercial sector, in fact, all the enterprises, startups, right, all these different industry organizations are relying a lot on these standards to gain assurance of service provider like AWS. And this actually saves them a lot of time, a lot of efforts, right, and costs in terms of compliance, right? And more importantly, they are able to leverage this to innovate faster and focus on differentiating their services, right, to their customers with high confidence of the security of the cloud, right? So adopting this the fundamental approach basically in the commercial world, right? So as I mentioned, another interesting scheme out there is the German C5, so-called the Cloud Computing Compliance Control Catalog, right? So C5 actually is based a lot on the ISO standards, and they basically again adopt the SOC 2 report as the prerequisite, right? So by using SOC 2 and ISO itself, they only required to verify some of these controls and with certain add-ons that they have. And one other difference that they have implemented is the self-disclosure itself. So self-disclosure basically is to provide more transparency of the cloud service provider in terms of things like the data location, the place of jurisdiction, right, the certification and duties of investigation, and disclosure towards government's agency. So they know what is the jurisdiction, right? Whether law enforcement access, will there be any problem? You know, all those questions that they may have is covered under the self-disclosure itself. So service provider provide the kind of transparency. So the Singapore standard, the multi-tier cloud security standard, basically have the same approach in terms of self-disclosure. So certified CSP basically publish their self-disclosure in the government website itself, the IMDA website in Singapore, right? So this is again a very useful approach, right, that save a lot of cost, resources, right, by doing the verification of the existing certification and only doing validation through the audit of additional controls that are over and above existing certification and the SOC reporting requirements. So besides the certification itself, the standards itself, right, that lay the foundation in terms of security requirements, the other aspect is the workloads. How do I classify, how do I determine what kind of workloads can go into the cloud, right? So a lot of traditionally, to determine what kind of data can go into what system, who can access what, is basically the data classification approach, right? So this approach is based on how sensitive or how strategic are the information and the classification level, right? So, and based on that, you evaluate the IT system, whether it can meet the classification, and also the security clearance of the people involved in accessing the system and the information itself, right? But this approach has certain problems when it comes to the cloud itself, right? So the challenges are basically it requires the system to be very stable, right? If there are changes, then you have to reevaluate the system, right? In the traditional environment, systems don't change that frequently, right? But in the internet environment, first of all, there are vulnerabilities update almost like every day, right? So you have to assess the severity of the vulnerabilities, and then you have to update the system once you know that this vulnerabilities is going to affect your environment, the patch is available, you have to do update. And you can't be reassessing all this all over again just because of the ongoing updates. And on top of that, right, service provider like AWS, right, we launch so many services every year, right? From 2011, there were 80 services, updates and features, right? To last year, there were nearly 2,000 services and updates and features, right? So every year there are so many new services. So you apply the old approach of data classification, which basically based on the military and intelligence organizations requirement, you are going to get stuck, right? How do I proceed? How do I deal with all these changes that are going on? So this can be very challenging if you just take this lock, stock, and barrel and try to use it, right? So we propose a slightly different approach. First of all, by having a tier approach, a 3-tier system, for example, to classify based on the impact level. FedRAMP is also based on impact level, by the way, right? So how impactful if the data or the systems have been compromised, right? So it is for information that are unclassified or public out there, right? Normally the impact is low to none, right? For administrative or restricted information, so to say, restricted in the context of Singapore, Malaysia, right? Restricted is actually the lowest classification, but in some other organizations, restricted is the highest, right? So we have to be careful what we mean here, right? So the impact could be minimum, right? Could be medium at most, right? Because of administrative, but mostly because of the aggregation that we are looking at, right? And then for high impact, those are things that probably related to national defense, strategic trade initiative, or maybe national intelligence kind of information, right? So for each of these tiers, then you define the security deployment model. What kind of security do I need to address the needs for this different impact level, right? So you can divide it again, level 1, level 2, level 3. So I state as basic, strong, and in-depth protection. Right, so for basic security, basically you can use all the baseline security features that are already available in the cloud environment, right? And then when you move up the ladder to strong, you can look at additional requirements like multi-factor authentication is a must, use of encryption is a must, high availability architecture is a must, right? So you up-level the requirements with additional controls, right? And then when it comes to in-depth protection, then you add on additional requirements, like maybe there's a mandatory segregation of the network using VPC, right? Or maybe you need a direct connection to the AWS region itself instead of going via the internet to come in, right? You need mandatory encryption, maybe with certain encryption devices that you want to use, right? Or keys that you are managing yourself, something like that, right? So that would allow you to go higher and higher up. The important about this is that, first of all, the level 1 and 2 or tier 1 and tier 2 should constitute maybe 80 or 90% of your workloads, right? It cannot be like majority of the workload are highly sensitive and classified. Then the government will stop operating, right? Everything is sensitive. Then how is it going to serve the public, right? That can be a problem, right? So we'll see that maybe 10 to 20% is really the real sensitive, right? In fact, a lot of things are like that, right? So when I was in my previous organization, we examined the IP, the intellectual property of our products, right? Often we find that about 10 to 15% of the code are really the IP really require IP protection. The rest of the code is either third-party codes or open source code, right? Or codes that you probably has been reused many times, right? They are no longer that sensitive, right? So the core data tends to be only about 10, 15%, at most 20%, right? So with this divide, what it means is that now you can actually go fast, right? You can actually apply things like the German C5 or the Singapore MTCS approach, right? To do verification for tier 1 and tier 2. And for tier 2, maybe you want the audit to take place for the additional controls that you add on. So this allows you to actually move very fast. Within a couple of months, you can clear the service provider to operate these tier 1 and tier 2 workloads. Even for tier 1, actually, simple verification approach means that within a month or two, you can actually start going, right? And what this means is that you can focus your valuable resources on what is really critical, the critical workloads out there, the 10 to 20% of the workload that are really critical. You want to go deep to really examine what the service provider are doing in those areas of concern, right? The additional controls that you really need to have, right? Those are the things that, and you can take your time to do that. That can take 6 months, 9 months, no problem, because majority of your workload is already going on, right? So another advantage is that because you start early, what does that mean? It means that you can actually learn about what is really about using the cloud, what is really about security in the cloud itself. And through that experience, you gain more knowledge, more experience about the cloud security, you can apply them in the tier 3 layers, right? So then your experience is used in protecting the most critical resource in your organization itself. So that is really critical, right? So this is the real benefits of taking this approach. So this chart basically summarizes the approach versus the challenges that we talked about earlier on. And basically, all this means that you are able to meet the criteria that you set up earlier on, right? So I will not go through the detail in the interest of time, right? But you can read the slide later on, basically, if you want to. So I think another key area of concern really is the shared responsibility area, right? If you look at a lot of this approach that the government takes, right, when they start examining the public cloud itself, the tendency is look at the cloud service provider, how secure they are, how can I gain confidence, how can I trust them, right? Where are my data? All those questions keep on coming up, right? But they forget that there is a part of responsibility that they have to take care of, right? How do I make sure that our guys, our people, know how to secure our stuff in the cloud itself, right? So anything that is below the virtualization layer, right, the host operating system, virtualization, the physical hardware, the data center, we are responsible, we take care of it, right? We manage it, but we expect our customers to be able to secure those things. Although we provide guidance, we provide tools, services, and all that to help customer, but the governments, the enterprise, they need policies, they need guidance, they need training, right, to address those needs. And this is the part that often miss out. And that's why a lot of organizations, right, have exposed data out there, because they forget that even though the CSP is secure, whatever workload they're running in the CSP may not be secure properly, right? So that is the part that they really need to pay attention, right? And that is the implication, right? So basically, governments need to establish a government-wide policy, right, in terms of how they are going to secure their workload inside the cloud, right? Of the cloud part, the security assurance, right, the accreditation system will take care of that. But don't put all your egg into that basket, right? Make sure that 80% of your resources actually focus on this and not in the accreditation, because service provider that I asked have so many accreditation, right? Like Steve mentioned yesterday, we have 210, right? The last count in terms of certification and attestation, right? So this is very important. And the other important aspect, right, is to re-engineer the IT operations and processes so that the people and the processes are able to operate the cloud and not based on the traditional approach, because the cloud environment is very different, right? The fundamentals are the same, right? The IP technologies, all those things are the same. VPC, security groups are very similar to things like firewall, networking, right? All those things very similar, but they are still very different, right? So there's a new approach that you have to apply. And so that's why, again, I quote our Prime Minister of Singapore saying this, right? Fundamental re-engineering of government is essential to provide better and faster public services. And this is what he is referring to. They have to basically retrain the workforce to be able to operate in the cloud, to be able to use the right services for the right kind of application, and able to provide the security to protect their data accordingly. So the outcomes of this approach basically is to help you realize the benefits of cloud-first policy earlier and faster cloud adoption, right? So by tiering the workloads itself, you can make sure that majority of them can go through very quickly, right? So better risk management and better returns in terms of your security investment, right? So you can, as I mentioned, you can learn from your low sensitive workload, right? By going fast with that, you can learn, because even those fail, even those get exposed, you are not going to have serious consequences. But you can learn very quickly, and because of the elasticity and the agility of the cloud itself, you can shut down system very quickly. You can do your investigation very, very quickly as well, right? So you can respond fast, you can act on it fast, and you learn fast, right? And that experience allows you to make sure that you can protect the most critical workloads with the most important resource as well, right? And increase focus on implementing your user side of your shared responsibility. Invest in this area and you will get very good outcome in terms of your cloud journey. Right, so what are other governments doing about cloud innovation? Right, so there is a whole lot of it, right? As I mentioned, more than 5,000 government organizations already using the cloud, more than 10,000 education institutes and 28,000 non-profit organizations already using the cloud. So there are many case studies out there, so I will urge you to visit this website and take a look at some of the examples out there. And one particular example I like to cite, I still have a few minutes, right, is that the Singapore government again, right, a few years ago, they started to consolidate all their web presence, right? A few hundred websites consolidated into a common web platform, right? So all the web presence, in fact, are public information in the first place. So that is the best place to start, right, your experience in the public cloud itself, right? And by doing that, they realized that usually in the traditional environment, they could take an hour to actually apply a security patch. And sometimes the patch will fail and they will encounter intermittent failure of up to 30 minutes of downtime, right? When they move to the cloud itself, right, the time for patch reduced from an hour to 7 minutes. That is 850% improvement. Right? When you count the number of servers, they have hundreds of websites. So it's maybe 1,000 or more than 1,000 servers out there, right? That kind of scale, 850% or 7 minutes is really important, right? Considering the windows of vulnerabilities, compared to 1 hour of vulnerability over thousands of servers and 7 minutes of vulnerabilities exposure. That is tremendous improvement in terms of efficiency as well as security. I think that is most important to every one of us. Right, so in closing, basically, right, gaining assurance is a key aspect, is a very important aspect, right, to move forward in your cloud adoption journey. But it is not the only thing, right, and it shouldn't be your showstopper. You shouldn't need to wait. You can adopt a process that allows you to run faster, right? So we learn from early adopters, right? We learn from the public cloud, public organization as well as commercial organizations, and you can adopt international standards and industry best practices. They are not going to be worse than any organization security policy, put it that way, right? Because they are contributed by people from those organizations, actually, from governments and from enterprise, participating in all these standards bodies. Right? Use the 80-20 principles, right? I must re-emphasize that allow you to move low impact or medium impact workloads faster and learn from their experience, right? And of course, take care of the user side of the shared responsibility model. Don't forget that you need to have policies to manage what is in the cloud, as well as re-engineer the operations and processes to be able to operate securely in the cloud. As mentioned by Steve yesterday, security has to be integrated part of the operation, right, throughout the organization in order to be successful and effective. With that, I think, yeah, so what's next is there are a couple of websites and white papers out there that I urge you to follow up as well, right? So the compliance website give you more information about our compliance program. These smart cloud native policy white papers basically describe the process that other governments have gone through in the cloud adoption journey, how they address some of the challenges that I mentioned, like budget issues, legacy system, procurement system. There's a big shift from capital expense to variable expense. So the procurement processes has to change, how they manage that, right? How they upskill the people and hire new talents to deal with, to be able to go into cloud faster and gain that experience. And of course, the papers over there, data classification, talks about some of the best practices out there in other governments. And logical separation basically talks about how we meet the US DoD high sensitivity requirements, right? They have a requirements for physical isolation, physical separation of hardware, right? But we work with them and prove that, in fact, the VPC, dedicated host, dedicated instance, encryption, right, and the use of bare metals, all these combined in various ways, it can actually achieve the requirements for the DoD. The objective that they need to achieve can be achieved through logical separation. You don't need to actually have physical separation, and you can still do it, right? And this paper basically describes the rationale behind and the facts that the justification that substantiate all those data itself. And then the 5-way organizations, how they get compromised, right? The 5 ways that organizations get compromised and how to protect ourselves. This blog basically talks about the common malware approach, right? Like social engineering attacks, all that, and how they actually gain access into the organization, and how things like data residency, localization, or physical separation is not going to solve your problem, right? But having proper security architecture, right? Proper security management, looking at every stack, especially in terms of monitoring, having proper drills, all these are important to be able to address these kind of issues out there that are constantly changing. Okay, with that, thank you very much for your attention. I'm glad that we still have an audience here after 1 hour. Thank you.